No one knew I had won $100 million. Not my friends, not my former coworkers, and certainly not my own flesh and blood. 3 days after finding out I held the winning Mega Millions ticket, I decided to test my family. I wanted to ask for their help, pretending I was struggling financially, just to see how they would react. I never imagined the ugly truth would come out at my only son's wedding, or that he would humiliate me in front of everyone. But before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who underestimated your worth, especially when that someone was family. The crystal chandeliers of the country club cast a warm golden glow over the rehearsal dinner, but standing in the shadows of an alcove near the hallway, I felt nothing but a bone-deep chill. I am Harrison Burke. I am 70 years old. For 40 of those years, I worked as a construction foreman. I breathed in dust, shattered my knees, and broke my back on steel and concrete, all to make sure my son Derek would never have to. I paid for his expensive university education with sweat and calluses. And tonight, wearing my only decent suit, a tailored wool piece I bought 10 years ago for my late wife's funeral, I was entirely invisible to him. The room was buzzing with the clinking of champagne flutes and the pretentious laughter of high society. Derek was 34 now, a hotshot chief financial officer who wore Italian silk suits that cost more than my first car. His fiancée Stephanie was 31. She came from old money, the kind of family that cared more about zip codes and exclusive memberships than actual human decency. I had spent the evening trying to stay out of the way, nursing a glass of tap water, watching them entertain their wealthy friends. I stepped back deeper into the alcove to rest my aching knees when I heard the sharp, unmistakable clack of Stephanie's heels approaching. She stopped just on the other side of the decorative pillar, hiding me, accompanied by two of her bridesmaids. "I am telling you, it is a nightmare," Stephanie hissed, her voice dripping with venom. I had to redo the seating chart 3 times. One of the bridesmaids giggled. "What is the problem?" "Just put the old man at a back table." "That is exactly what I am doing," Stephanie said, sighing dramatically. "I mean, look at him. He is a broke, senile embarrassment. He showed up tonight looking like a janitor who wandered in off the street. My parents have major investors coming tomorrow. Highly important guests who cannot be subjected to a retired construction worker rambling about pouring concrete. We are putting him at table 42. "Table 42, the bridesmaid asked. "Is that not right next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen?" "Exactly," Stephanie sneered. "The waiters will block him from view. He can eat his dry chicken, use the restrooms right next to him, and stay entirely out of the professional wedding photos. It is the only way to salvage the aesthetic of the evening." My chest tightened. The words felt like physical blows, a broke, senile embarrassment. I held my breath, waiting, hoping, praying that my son, my own flesh and blood, would step in. Right on cue, I heard Derek's familiar voice join the group. "What are we plotting over here, ladies?" he asked, his tone smooth and charming. "Derek, sweetheart." Stephanie whined, immediately shifting into a victim's voice. "I was just telling the girls about the seating arrangement for your father. Table 42. You are okay with that, right? I just do not want him bothering my dad's business partners." I waited for Derek to defend me. I waited for the boy I carried on my shoulders, the boy I taught to ride a bike, to tell his future wife that she was crossing a line. Instead, Derek chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that shattered the last remaining piece of my paternal heart. "Do whatever you have to do," Stephanie, Derek said dismissively. "I told you my dad is just a clueless old man. He is a necessary family burden at this point. I only invited him because it would look worse for my public image if the groom's father was missing. Just keep him by the kitchen doors. He probably feels more at home around the hired help anyway." The 3 women laughed, and Derek laughed right along with them. They clinked their expensive glasses together and walked back toward the main dining area, leaving me alone in the shadows. A younger version of myself might have stepped out from that pillar and caused a scene. A younger version of myself might have yelled, cried, or begged for the respect I had earned through decades of sacrifice. But I did not cry. My eyes were completely dry. Instead, as I listened to the fading sound of my son's laughter, a slow, cold smile spread across my face. My hands, rough and scarred from labor, stopped trembling. The pain in my chest was instantly replaced by a sharp, icy clarity. They thought I was a broke, senile embarrassment. They thought I was a burden they had to hide away like a dirty secret. What Derek and Stephanie did not know, what absolutely nobody in that room knew, was that exactly 3 weeks ago, my life had changed forever. I had walked into a lottery office under the strict protection of a blind trust managed by my lawyer, Richard Dalton. I had claimed the massive jackpot. After taxes, my net worth was sitting at a staggering $48 million in pure liquid cash. When I first saw those numbers in my bank account, I remembered the words of my late wife, Patricia. She used to tell me that money does not change people. It just takes off their masks. She was right. I had decided to keep the money an absolute secret. I wanted to observe my family to see who truly loved me and who was just waiting for me to fade away. I looked down at my scuffed dress shoes, then out toward the glittering ballroom. Derek thought he had all the power because he wore a fancy suit and held a corporate title. He thought he could treat me like trash just because he believed my bank account was empty. They had picked the absolute wrong week to humiliate me, because I was no longer just an old, retired foreman. I was a man with enough money and leverage to completely rewrite reality. Tomorrow, at their perfect high society wedding, I was going to teach my son exactly what happens when you throw away the man who built your entire world. Exactly 3 weeks before that rehearsal dinner, my reality was entirely different. I was just an old man sitting at a scratched kitchen table staring at a stack of past-due utility bills and rubbing my swollen knees. For 4 decades, I lived my life on brutal construction sites. I was always the first man to arrive when the sun was not even up, and the absolute last man to leave when the concrete finally set. I hauled heavy steel, I swung sledgehammers, and I breathed in toxic drywall dust until my lungs burned. I sacrificed my own physical body so my family would never have to know the bitter sting of poverty. Every single time my back screamed in pure agony, I thought of Derek. I thought of the massive tuition bills for his elite Ivy League business school. I signed those expensive checks with hands that were cracked and bleeding, but I did it with a heart full of immense pride. I genuinely believed I was building a solid foundation for a son who would respect the dirt on my work boots, because it paid for the prestigious diploma hanging on his wall. How terribly wrong I was. That Tuesday morning, a cold rain was beating against the window of my modest home. I drank cheap instant coffee, dreading the upcoming winter heating costs. I reached into my worn coat pocket and pulled out a lottery ticket I had bought on a whim at the corner gas station. It was a simple habit, a tiny sliver of hope I allowed myself just once a week. I turned on the small television on the kitchen counter and waited for the local news to display the Mega Millions numbers. The anchor read them out slowly: 5, 17, 43, 52, 61. And the gold mega ball, 12. I looked down at my ticket. Then I looked back at the bright screen. I blinked, rubbed my tired eyes, and read the printed numbers again. They matched perfectly. Every single one of them. My heart stopped beating in my chest. The jackpot was over $100 million. I sat there in the quiet kitchen, tightly gripping the small piece of paper that had suddenly become the most valuable thing in my entire world. I knew immediately that I would take the lump sum cash option. After federal and state taxes, the final deposit would be exactly $48 million in pure liquid cash. My first instinct was to pick up the phone and call Derek. I wanted to scream with joy. I wanted to tell him that our struggles were permanently over, that I could pay off his expensive mortgage, that I could entirely fund his lavish wedding without him having to stress over a single detail. My trembling finger hovered over his name on my phone screen. But then a memory hit me hard. It was a memory of my late wife, Patricia, from many years ago when we saw a neighbor win a small local lawsuit and suddenly turn his back on everyone who cared about him. Patricia had looked at me with her gentle, knowing eyes and said something I never forgot. She told me money does not change people, Harrison. It just takes off their masks. It reveals who they have always been. Her voice echoed in my mind crystal clear in the deafening silence of my empty house. I slowly lowered the phone. Derek had been acting strange lately. He had been distant, dismissive, and clearly embarrassed by my presence around his new wealthy friends. If I handed him millions of dollars right now, I would never know if he truly loved his father or if he just loved my bank account. I decided right then to keep my mouth shut. I did not go to the local lottery office. I did not jump up and down in the street. Instead, I researched the absolute best financial legal representation money could buy. I hired Richard Dalton, an elite wealth manager and attorney who specialized in handling massive assets for the ultra-rich. Rick was a sharp, highly discreet professional who knew exactly how to navigate the complex world of sudden wealth. We met in a secure private office downtown. I told him my situation and my desire for complete anonymity. Rick set to work. He rapidly established a blind trust for me structured through a limited liability company based in Texas, a state that allows lottery winners to legally shield their identities from the public record. Within days, the LLC officially claimed the prize. The $48 million was safely deposited into multiple high-yield, highly secure accounts, strictly under the trust's name. As far as the public, the government, and my own family knew, Harrison Burke was still just a retired construction foreman, living on a modest, fixed income. Sitting across from Rick in his polished boardroom, looking at a pristine bank statement with more zeros than I had ever seen, a heavy realization settled over me. I now had the absolute power to change my children's lives forever. But I needed to know if they actually deserved it. I needed to see their true, unmasked faces before I distributed a single dime of this newfound fortune. I told him to hold all the funds tight. I explained that I was going to enact a specific test. I would approach my son Derek not as a secret millionaire, but as a desperate, broken father who had just lost absolutely everything. I wanted to see if the successful son I broke my back to raise would offer his hand to pull me up, or if he would cruelly kick me while I was down. I left Rick's office that afternoon with my plan fully formed. I was certainly going to play the victim. I would ask for the bare minimum of human decency and family loyalty. The outcome of that test would determine the entire rest of my life. The morning after the rehearsal dinner, I woke up in the modest, aging home I had lived in for 40 years. The sun was barely rising, casting long gray shadows across the faded linoleum floor of my kitchen. I sat at the scratched wooden table, wrapping my hands around a chipped ceramic mug filled with bitter black coffee. My bones ached from the damp cold that always seemed to seep through the poorly insulated walls, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. The memory of my son laughing at me, calling me a clueless old man just hours prior, still burned in my chest like a hot coal. I looked around the room. The peeling wallpaper, the dripping faucet, the worn-out fabric of my armchair. It was a humble life, a life built on honest, back-breaking labor. But the reality was, I could buy this entire neighborhood 10 times over with a single phone call to Rick Dalton. I did not need to stay in this house. I did not need to worry about the dripping faucet or the winter heating bills. I was a man possessing $48 million. Yet I sat there breathing in the stale air, preparing myself for the most important performance of my entire life. It was time to initiate the test. It was time to see exactly what kind of man my son had truly become when he thought there was nothing left to gain from me. I reached for my phone, an outdated model with a cracked screen and slowly scrolled through my contacts until I found Derek. My thumb hovered over his name for a brief second before I pressed call. I lifted the phone to my ear, listening to the steady, rhythmic ringing. I knew he was likely busy. It was the day before his extravagant high society wedding. He was probably finalizing details for the ice sculptures or the imported floral arrangements. Finally, the line clicked open. Derek answered, his voice tight and dripping with irritation. He did not say hello. He simply asked what I needed so early in the morning. He reminded me he had a massive schedule, and Stephanie was already stressing over caterers. Then I took a deep, shaky breath, channeling all my pain and disappointment into my vocal cords. I forced my voice to waver. I made my breathing sound ragged and uneven, like a man who had not slept, a man standing on the very edge of a terrifying cliff. I called out his name, letting my voice crack perfectly on the second syllable. I told him I was so sorry to bother him on such an important day, but that I had nowhere else to turn. I told him I was in terrible trouble. Derek sighed loudly into the receiver. I could hear the heavy rustle of expensive fabric as he shifted impatiently. He asked me what was wrong, his tone implying that whatever it was an enormous inconvenience. I leaned over my kitchen table, squeezing my eyes shut to project pure desperation into the phone. I told him I had made a terrible mistake. I explained that months ago a financial broker had approached me with an investment opportunity. I spun a tale about wanting to grow my small retirement fund for a little extra security. I told him the broker promised guaranteed returns, and like a foolish, desperate old man, I trusted him. I let my voice drop to a pathetic, trembling whisper. I told my son that the broker was a fraud. The investment firm collapsed entirely. I said the authorities were involved, but the money was completely gone. Every penny I scraped together over 40 years of destroying my body on construction sites had vanished. I paused, letting out a jagged, manufactured sob. I then delivered the final crushing blow of the lie. I told him that because I had leveraged my house to secure the investment, the bank was foreclosing. I told my own flesh and blood that I was completely bankrupt, absolutely destitute, and facing immediate eviction by the end of the month. I begged him for help. I stripped away every ounce of my paternal pride and pleaded with my son to save me from living on the streets. I stopped speaking and waited. I waited for the shock. I waited for the panic. I waited for my son to tell me that everything was going to be all right, that he loved me, that he would never let his father go homeless. Instead, I was met with dead, suffocating silence. The silence stretched on for an eternity. I could hear his steady, calm breathing through the speaker. There was no gasp of horror. There were no comforting words of familial loyalty. When Derek finally spoke, his voice was entirely devoid of warmth. It was cold, calculated, and sharp as a razor blade. He did not ask how I felt. He did not ask for the broker's name. He let out another exhausted sigh. He told me that this was incredibly bad timing. He said he could not deal with this kind of dramatic crisis over the phone while Stephanie was getting her hair done in the next room. His tone was not that of a son speaking to his devastated father, but of a busy executive dealing with a frustrating, incompetent employee. He instructed me to come to his luxury downtown apartment immediately so we could discuss it and figure out what to do with me. Without saying goodbye, he hung up the phone. The phone line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear, staring at the blank screen. The test had officially begun. I stood up from my scratched wooden table, feeling a cold resolve settle deep within my bones. I walked over to the hallway closet and grabbed my heavy winter coat. It was time to go see my son's true colors. The drive into the city was a jarring transition from my quiet neighborhood to a world of towering glass and steel. I parked my rusted pickup truck a few blocks away, knowing the valet would likely turn me away from the pristine entrance. I walked the remaining distance, pulling my thin collar tight against the biting wind. The building was a fortress of modern luxury, a towering monolith that demanded respect and radiated exclusivity. A doorman in a tailored uniform eyed me with immediate suspicion as I approached the heavy glass doors. I had to state my name and announce that I was expected at the penthouse. The doorman made a hushed phone call, his eyes never leaving my scuffed boots. After a tense moment, he gave a stiff nod and directed me toward a private, polished elevator that required a security keycard to operate. The elevator ascended with a silent speed, leaving my stomach far behind. When the polished doors finally slid open, they did not reveal a hallway, but opened directly into Derek's massive penthouse apartment. The sheer scale of the wealth struck me like a physical blow. The floors were white marble that reflected the panoramic skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Above me hung a modern asymmetrical chandelier that looked more like a museum installation than a simple light fixture. The furniture was sleek, minimalist, and undeniably expensive, arranged perfectly over thick, plush rugs. I stood awkwardly in the foyer, acutely aware of how entirely out of place I looked. I looked down at my own hands. They were deeply tanned, permanently scarred, and textured like rough sandpaper from a lifetime of hauling heavy steel and pouring concrete. I contrasted my worn, calloused hands against the flawless, pristine surfaces surrounding me. My son lived like royalty, surrounded by untouchable perfection, while I stood there in a coat that smelled faintly of old sawdust and cheap laundry detergent. Derek walked into the main living area, followed closely by Stephanie. Derek wore crisp designer slacks and an ironed dress shirt with sleeves rolled up, revealing a heavy luxury watch. Stephanie wore a silk robe, her hair styled into elegant waves for the upcoming wedding festivities. They did not walk forward to greet me with a hug or even a simple handshake. They stood several feet away, their body language stiff and uninviting. Stephanie crossed her arms over her chest, tapping a manicured finger against her arm, radiating pure irritation at my unannounced presence. Derek ran a hand through his expensive haircut, looking at me as if I were a stranger who had simply wandered into the wrong building. The psychological contrast was even sharper than the visual one. I was his father, the man who had given up his own body to build the foundation for this exact life, yet I was being treated like a pest. I forced my shoulders to slump forward physically, shrinking myself to appear as broken and small as possible. I let my hands tremble slightly as I took a hesitant step toward them. I looked directly into my son's eyes and began the performance. I repeated the lie I had told on the phone, adding layers of panicked detail. I told him how the broker forged documents, how the bank sent a notice of foreclosure, and how the sheriff would arrive by the end of the month to forcefully remove my belongings. I made sure my voice cracked with raw, visceral emotion. I told him that I was terrified, that I had never asked him for a single thing in his entire adult life, but that I was completely out of options. I clasped my rough hands together, begging him for a loan of just $5,000. I promised him it was only to satisfy the bank temporarily, to keep the roof over my head while I figured out a long-term plan. $5,000 was absolute pocket change to a man who lived in a penthouse like this. It was less than the cost of the chandelier hanging directly above my head. Derek remained perfectly silent, his face an emotionless mask. He did not offer a word of comfort. He did not step forward to reassure his terrified father. I pushed the test even further, twisting the knife of my fake desperation. I told him that even with the $5,000, I might still lose the house. I looked at Stephanie, offering her a weak, pleading smile before turning back to Derek. I asked if in case the bank took the house, I could stay in their spare guest bedroom for a short while. Just 2 months, I pleaded, my voice barely above a whisper. Just 8 weeks so I could find a cheap apartment and secure government assistance. I promised I would stay out of their way, that I would cook and make myself useful. I stripped away every ounce of my remaining dignity, standing in the middle of their marble fortress, asking for nothing more than a tiny corner of their massive home to sleep in, so I would not freeze on the winter streets. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The tension in the vast room was so thick, it felt like it could shatter the windows. Stephanie slowly turned her head and looked at Derek. They exchanged a very specific, highly calculated look. It was a look that contained zero sympathy, zero pity, and zero love. It was a look of profound shared annoyance. It was the look two people exchange when figuring out how to quickly dispose of a piece of garbage dropped into their pristine home. Derek finally broke the eye contact with his fiancée. He turned his gaze back to me, his eyes cold and utterly devoid of compassion. He rolled his shoulders back, standing perfectly straight in his expensive clothes. Then he took a deep, steadying breath, preparing his throat to deliver a calculated, devastating lie. Derek exhaled a long, heavy breath, dropping his shoulders to mimic the posture of defeat I had just presented. He walked over to the sprawling kitchen island, leaning his weight against the polished stone, as if the mere thought of my problems was exhausting him. "Dad," he began, his voice laced with a practiced, sorrowful resonance. "You have absolutely no idea how terrible your timing is. I wish I could help you with this terrible situation right now. I really do, but I am completely broke." The words hung in the air, audacious and perfectly delivered. He swept his hand in a wide arc, gesturing to the multi-million-dollar penthouse surrounding us. "I know how this looks," he continued, anticipating my silent confusion. "But this place, the expensive furniture, the luxurious lifestyle, it is all just a temporary mirage. The wedding has completely bled us dry and left our bank accounts completely empty. We are drowning in expenses we never anticipated. The caterers, the venue, the floral arrangements. They all doubled their rates at the last minute. We are stretched so incredibly thin right now that I am losing my sleep every single night, trying to figure out how to keep the lights on." He stepped closer, placing a hand on his hip, shaking his head with a perfectly manufactured expression of regret. "My credit cards are entirely maxed out, Dad. I have leveraged every asset I have to make sure Stephanie gets the day she deserves. If I had $5,000, I would give it to you in a heartbeat. But I simply do not have a single dollar to spare right now. I am essentially living paycheck to paycheck." He paused, letting the weight of his fabricated poverty settle over me. I watched his face carefully, searching for a single twitch of guilt. There was absolutely nothing. He was delivering a masterclass in deception, staring directly into the eyes of his father. And as for the guest room, he added, his tone growing slightly more rigid, "I cannot offer you that either. The extended family of Stephanie is flying in from out of town this week. Every single square inch of this apartment is already spoken for. Her parents, her siblings, her cousins, they are all staying here because we simply could not afford to put them up in a hotel. There is literally no room for you here." He looked at me with cold, unblinking eyes. He was playing the ultimate victim, entirely dismissing the father who had broken his own spine to give him life. Before I could utter a single word in response, Stephanie stepped forward from the background. The rigid annoyance she had displayed moments ago was instantly replaced by a mask of sickly, sweet, condescending pity. She glided across the marble floor, her silk robe flowing elegantly behind her. She walked behind the kitchen island and opened a small, leather-bound drawer. When she pulled her hand back, she was holding a crisp, perfectly flat $100 bill. She walked around the counter and approached me, holding the money out as if she were offering a treat to a stray animal. Alongside the bill, she held a brightly colored, cheaply printed brochure. She placed both items gently onto the edge of the kitchen counter, sliding them toward my calloused hands. I looked down at the paper. It was a pamphlet for a state-funded, heavily subsidized nursing home located on the absolute worst side of the city, a facility known for its grim conditions and forgotten residents. Stephanie offered a tight, sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes. "They have government programs for people in your situation, Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You need professional care. You should call the number on the back. They can assign you a social worker. We just cannot carry your weight right now. It is simply too much for us to bear." I stared at the crisp $100 bill and the glossy pamphlet resting on the pristine marble counter. The absolute audacity of their performance was staggering. They were standing in a penthouse that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime, handing me a single $100 bill and a brochure for a destitute nursing home. They expected me to simply fade away into the cold shadows of society. I slowly reached out with my trembling, scarred hand. I picked up the $100 bill and folded it carefully, slipping it into the breast pocket of my worn coat. Then I picked up the pamphlet, gripping it tight enough to crease the cheap paper. I looked at Derek one last time. I did not break character. I nodded my head slowly, letting a look of profound, devastating defeat wash over my face. "I understand," I whispered, my voice incredibly frail. "I am sorry to have burdened you both. Have a beautiful wedding." I turned my back on my only son and slowly walked toward the polished elevator. I dragged my feet, playing the part of the broken man, until the heavy doors slid shut, sealing me inside the descending metal box. As the elevator plummeted toward the ground floor, my posture instantly straightened. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. The tragic performance was officially over. I knew with absolute certainty that they were lying to my face. A man with maxed-out credit cards does not live in a pristine penthouse. A couple drowning in debt does not plan a massive, extravagant wedding event. They were spinning a deliberate web of deceit to protect their wealth from the man who gave them everything. I clutched the pamphlet in my fist, a cold fury igniting in my veins. I knew they were lying to me. What I did not know as I stepped out of the building and into the biting winter wind was exactly how deep and how incredibly dark that lie actually went. The freezing wind whipped across the concrete pavement as I stepped out from the towering shadow of my son's luxury building. I pulled my worn collar up against my neck, feeling the sharp contrast between the bitter cold of the street and the sickening warmth of the penthouse I had just left. I walked a few long blocks away, needing some physical distance between myself and the suffocating, cruel arrogance of Derek and Stephanie. I found a quiet, empty bus stop bench and sat down. My hands were still shaking slightly from the cold adrenaline coursing through my veins. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cracked phone. I needed a baseline. I needed to know if the toxic entitlement I witnessed was my failure as a father, or if it was uniquely contained within my son. I pressed the green call button for my daughter, Rachel. Rachel was a dedicated nurse who spent her days running between hospital rooms and her nights drowning beneath the crushing weight of student loans. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice breathless and heavy with exhaustion. She was right in the middle of a brutal double shift. I closed my eyes, hating myself for putting her through this emotional test, but I needed to be absolutely certain. I lowered my voice, projecting the exact same manufactured panic I had just used on her brother. I delivered the lie flawlessly. I told her about the fraudulent broker, the collapsed investment firm, and the bank foreclosing on the family home. I told her I was completely bankrupt and facing immediate eviction. I waited, holding my breath. There was no heavy sigh of annoyance. There was no calculated look of irritation. Instead, I heard a sharp, sudden intake of air. Without a single second of hesitation, Rachel shifted into pure survival mode for my sake. She did not ask how I could be so foolish. She did not complain about her own massive debts or the exhausting hours she worked. Her voice was laced with absolute unyielding determination. She told me to pack my bags immediately. She said her small apartment only had one bedroom, but the living room sofa was mine. She promised she would pick up a third shift working weekend nights at an urgent care clinic, just to make sure we had enough money for groceries. She told me we would figure it out together, because that is what family does. An overwhelming wave of emotion crashed into my chest, tightening my throat until I could barely breathe. A single tear slipped down my weathered cheek. Here was my daughter, a woman who had absolutely nothing to spare, offering to sacrifice her own health to save a father she believed had lost everything. The contrast between her pure love and Derek's cruel rejection was staggering. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to remain steady so I would not betray the truth. I told her how deeply I loved her, and how proud her mother would be of the woman she had become. I assured her that I had a temporary solution, lined up a small grace period, to figure out my next steps. I lied and said a former construction buddy was letting me stay in an empty trailer for the season. I refused to let her take on a third job, promising her I was safe for now. I told her to focus on her patients and get some sleep when her shift ended. We exchanged our goodbyes, and I ended the call. I sat on the bench for a long moment, letting the warmth of Rachel's love wash over the bitter sting of Derek's betrayal. I finally stood up and began the walk back toward my truck. My path forced me past the grand entrance of my son's apartment building. I kept my head down, not wanting to draw the attention of the doorman. But a sudden roar of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet street. A transport truck was blocking the loading zone, and slowly backing down from the ramp was a brand-new Porsche. The sleek sports car gleamed under the streetlights, a pure manifestation of extreme wealth. I stopped walking, stepping silently behind a decorative concrete planter to watch. The driver's side door swung open, and the person who stepped out made my blood run cold. It was Derek. He had changed into a tailored leather jacket, walking around the vehicle with an arrogant grin plastered across his face. The building concierge rushed out from the glass doors holding a clipboard. The concierge beamed a subservient smile, handing over the paperwork. He practically bowed as he spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the crisp air. "Enjoy the new car, Mr. Burke," the concierge said. "Your wire transfer cleared an hour ago." Derek signed the receipt without looking, tossing the clipboard back before sliding into the driver's seat. I stood frozen, my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Just 30 minutes ago, my son had looked me dead in the eyes. He had sworn on his life that he was completely broke, drowning in wedding debt, and living paycheck to paycheck. He had handed me a single $100 bill and a nursing home pamphlet. Yet he had just paid for a $150,000 sports car using a direct cash wire transfer. You do not buy a luxury vehicle with cash if your credit cards are maxed out. You do not drop a fortune on a toy if you are struggling to keep the lights on. Derek had blatantly lied to my face. But where did a supposedly broke man get that kind of liquid cash overnight? A dark realization began to form in my stomach. My intuition suddenly screamed that something was terribly wrong. The lie was not just about avoiding his father. The lie was covering up a financial rot that I was only just beginning to uncover. I watched the taillights of the sports car disappear around the corner, my chest heaving with a mixture of profound grief and boiling anger. The freezing wind no longer bothered me. A cold, hard shield had formed around my heart. I stepped out from behind the concrete planter and walked the remaining blocks to my rusted pickup truck. I unlocked the heavy metal door, climbed into the freezing cabin, and slammed it shut, sealing myself inside the quiet space. I did not turn the key in the ignition. I simply sat there in the driver's seat, gripping the worn leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white. The image of Derek casually signing for a $150,000 vehicle flashed repeatedly in my mind. He had looked me in the eye and handed me a single $100 bill. He had handed me a pamphlet for a squalid nursing home. He had told me he was drowning in debt. The sheer magnitude of his deception was breathtaking. But Derek had made a critical miscalculation. He believed he was dealing with a broken, helpless old man. He had no idea he was dealing with a man who now possessed the ultimate resources to tear his perfect fabricated world apart, layer by layer, until nothing but the absolute truth remained exposed to the light. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone for the second time that hour. I bypassed my family contacts and scrolled straight to the secure number for Richard Dalton. It was a private line reserved only for his highest net worth clients. He answered almost immediately, his voice sharp, professional, and entirely alert. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him that the test was over, and the results were worse than I could have ever imagined. I told him my son had failed in every conceivable way, but that his failure was accompanied by a massive financial inconsistency that I needed investigated immediately. I instructed Rick to hire the absolute best private investigators and forensic accountants available in the city. I told him I did not care what it cost. I wanted a team of relentless professionals to descend upon the life of my son. I wanted them to track every single penny that entered and exited his personal bank accounts. I wanted his credit reports, his property deeds, his tax returns, and his wedding vendor contracts pulled and examined. I wanted his entire financial existence laid bare on a table for me to dissect. Rick listened silently, taking notes on his end of the line. He did not question my motives or try to calm me down. He simply operated with the cold efficiency I was paying him for. He asked me if there were any specific assets or accounts he should tell his team to prioritize. I leaned my head back against the cold headrest of my truck, closing my eyes as a heavy wave of dread washed over me. There was one specific account. After my wife Patricia passed away, I was consumed by a suffocating grief. I could barely manage to get out of bed, let alone handle the complex paperwork of settling her final medical bills and organizing our modest estate. Derek had stepped in, acting like the dutiful, caring son. He suggested we open a joint legacy bank account. He told me it would be much easier for him to manage the tedious financial transitions and pay the remaining hospital debts if his name was legally attached to the funds. I trusted him completely. I transferred my entire life savings into that joint account. It was exactly $80,000, the sum total of 40 years of brutal physical labor and strict budgeting. I explained all of this to Rick. I told him that once the medical bills were settled, I simply left the remaining funds in that joint account, viewing it as my emergency retirement safety net. I had not checked the balance or looked at a single statement in over 5 years. I never felt the need to. I assumed the money was safely gathering a small amount of interest, quietly sitting there for the day my knees finally gave out completely. But after watching Derek buy a luxury sports car with cash while claiming poverty, a sickening feeling had taken root deep in my gut. I told Rick to have his forensic accountants pull the complete transaction history for that specific joint account. I needed to know if my son was simply hiding his own massive wealth, or if his sudden influx of cash was somehow connected to the money I had blindly trusted him to protect. Rick promised me he would have a team deployed within the hour. He assured me that men with the arrogance of Derek always left a trail of careless digital footprints behind them. He said financial secrets were incredibly difficult to keep hidden when top-tier professionals were actively hunting them down. I sincerely thanked him for his swift and decisive action and told him I was driving back to my house to wait for the results. Rick told me to try and get some rest, though we both knew sleep would be entirely impossible tonight. Before ending the call, his voice dropped to a grave, serious tone. He promised me that he would compile all the findings and have a comprehensive preliminary financial dossier ready for me by the very next morning. I lowered the phone slowly, watching the bright glass screen going completely dark in the palms of my trembling hands. The wheels of justice were now officially in motion. The wolves had been unleashed, and they were actively tracking the scent of my son. I finally turned the ignition key, the old engine sputtering to life. I was ready to drive home and face whatever devastating truth the cold light of tomorrow morning would inevitably bring to my doorstep. The sun barely crested the horizon when I pulled my truck into the underground garage of the financial district. I had not slept a single minute. I spent the night sitting in the dark of my living room, staring at the walls, replaying the events of the previous day. I parked, feeling a heavy weight settling onto my shoulders. I took the private elevator up to the secure executive floor where Richard Dalton operated his firm. The doors opened to a silent, impeccably clean reception area. Rick was already waiting in his polished boardroom, wearing a sharp suit and a grim expression. The large mahogany table in front of him was covered in thick, neatly organized manila folders. A steaming cup of black coffee sat untouched beside his hands. I walked into the room and took a seat across from him, my joints aching with the familiar sting of exhaustion and dread. Rick did not offer any empty platitudes. He simply looked at me with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing to operate. He placed his hands flat on the top folder, took a deep breath, and warned me that what he was about to show me would shatter whatever remaining illusions I held about my son and his future bride. I nodded slowly, bracing myself for the impact. Rick opened the first folder and began to lay out the stark reality of Stephanie and her supposedly prestigious family. For years, Derek had relentlessly bragged about marrying into old money. He had painted a picture of the Reed family as untouchable aristocrats possessing generational wealth and unrivaled social standing. He had used their status to justify his arrogance to excuse his cruel dismissal of my blue-collar roots. But the private investigators had dug beneath the glittering surface, and the truth they uncovered was absolutely pathetic. Rick slid a series of financial documents across the smooth wood. The Reed family was completely broke. They were drowning in a sea of secret, overwhelming debt. Their sprawling suburban estate was heavily mortgaged with multiple liens placed against the property. Her father, the arrogant man who looked down his nose at everyone, was currently facing quiet bankruptcy proceedings from a string of failed business ventures. They were a family surviving entirely on extended credit and smokescreens, desperate to maintain their elite social image while their financial foundation crumbled beneath their feet. Stephanie was not a wealthy heiress. She was a desperate woman clinging to a sinking ship, maintaining her haughty attitude through sheer force of delusion. The revelation hit me with bitter irony. She had handed me a pamphlet for a destitute nursing home while her own family was teetering on the brink of total financial ruin. But the deception did not end with Stephanie and her parents. Rick opened the second folder, revealing a thick stack of bank transfers and credit card statements belonging entirely to Derek. My son was not just marrying into a desperate family. He was actively financing their grand illusion. The documents showed a sickening pattern of extreme reckless spending. Derek had been systematically paying off Stephanie's massive credit card bills for the past 2 years. He was funding her luxurious shopping sprees, her designer wardrobe, and her frequent vacations to exotic resorts. He had purchased his way into her elite social circle using his high corporate salary to prop up the failing facade of the Reed family legacy. He was desperate to be accepted by the upper class, desperate to scrub away the dirt of his working-class upbringing, and willing to bleed himself completely dry to achieve it. I looked at the staggering numbers highlighted in bright yellow ink. Hundreds of thousands of dollars squandered on pure vanity. It was a sickening display of profound insecurity. My son had lost his soul to the poisonous allure of social prestige. He was living an expensive lie, terrified that his new wealthy friends would discover he was just the son of a humble construction foreman. Rick then turned to the details of the extravagant wedding that was scheduled to take place the very next day. Derek had proudly told me and everyone else who would listen that Stephanie's traditional wealthy parents were footing the enormous bill for the grand celebration. He had claimed they insisted on paying for the lavish venue, the imported flowers, and the elite catering to maintain their high society standards. But the forensic accountants had traced every single vendor payment, every deposit, and every final invoice. Rick placed a comprehensive spreadsheet in front of me. The total cost of the wedding was a staggering $300,000. Every single penny of that obscene amount had been paid directly from Derek's personal accounts. Stephanie's family had not contributed a single dime. Derek had drained his own liquidity and maxed out multiple high-limit credit cards to stage the ultimate theatrical performance of wealth. He had lied to me when he said he was broke, but the tragic reality was that he had voluntarily pushed himself to the edge of financial ruin just to feed his fragile ego. I sat in the quiet boardroom, digesting the sheer magnitude of the pathetic reality laid out before me. My son was a fraud, living a fake life with a fake heiress, but the most devastating piece of information was yet to come. Rick closed the folders containing the vendor receipts and the credit card statements. The grim professional composure he had maintained throughout the entire meeting suddenly cracked. He looked at me with an expression of genuine sympathy. He reached for the last manila folder resting at the bottom of the stack. He opened it slowly, his jaw set in a tight, rigid line. He flipped to the last page of the dense financial dossier. It was a document bearing the familiar logo of my own community bank. Without saying a word, Rick slid the bank statement across the polished mahogany desk toward my trembling hands. I looked down at the crisp, white piece of paper resting in front of me on the dark wood. The heading bore the familiar logo of the local community bank I had used for my entire adult life. I squinted slightly, reading the account number printed at the top of the page. It was the joint legacy account, the exact safety net I had opened with Derek shortly after Patricia passed away. My eyes drifted downward, moving past the identifying information and searching for the bold text that would indicate my total available balance. I expected to see the familiar $80,000, perhaps with a few extra dollars of accumulated interest. Instead, my eyes locked onto a single devastating digit. The final balance printed on the official bank statement was 0. There was absolutely nothing left in the account. I blinked repeatedly, my mind struggling to process the visual information. I thought there must have been some kind of administrative error. I looked up at Rick, my face contorted in absolute confusion, waiting for him to explain the obvious mistake. Rick let out a long, heavy breath and folded his hands together on the surface of the desk. He told me there was no mistake. He explained that his forensic accountants had meticulously tracked the activity in that specific account over the past 6 months. Derek had systematically drained every single penny of my life savings. Rick slid a supplementary report toward me detailing a long list of outbound wire transfers and electronic withdrawals. Derek had completely bypassed the need for my physical signature by utilizing forged digital authorizations. He had abused the joint status of the account to siphon away my entire financial safety net, taking a few $1,000s at a time to avoid triggering any automated fraud alerts from the bank. I ran my calloused finger down the long list of itemized withdrawals. I asked Rick exactly where my money had gone. I wanted to know exactly what my son deemed more important than his own father's physical survival and health. Rick pointed to several specific transactions near the bottom of the page, linking the stolen funds directly to Derek's wedding vendor receipts. The money that I had earned by destroying my spine and breathing in toxic dust for 4 decades had not been used to pay off essential debts or secure a necessary future. Derek had used my blood, sweat, and tears to pay for pure, fleeting vanity. My entire life savings had been completely liquidated to fund a massive custom-built champagne tower and a ridiculous quantity of imported French orchids for his wedding reception. My physical agony had been converted into a few hours of extravagant floral arrangements and overflowing alcohol meant to impress a room full of arrogant strangers. A sickening wave of nausea washed over me as the absolute truth finally settled firmly into my bones. The entire interaction in Derek's penthouse the previous day replayed in my mind, but this time with a horrifying new context. When I stood in his marble kitchen and begged him for $5,000 to save my home from foreclosure, he knew he had already stolen $80,000 from me. When he looked me dead in the eyes and swore he was completely broke, he was actively spending my money on his wedding. He did not just cruelly reject a bankrupt father who came to him in a moment of desperate need. He was the literal architect of my bankruptcy. He was the thief who had completely hollowed out my future. And knowing that he had left me completely destitute, knowing he was the primary reason I would theoretically be living on the winter streets, his only response was to hand me a crisp $100 bill and a pamphlet for a squalid state-funded nursing home. For a very long time, I simply sat there in the silent boardroom. I felt a profound, suffocating grief attempting to take hold of my heart. I mourned the son I thought I had raised. I mourned the little boy who used to tightly hold my rough hand as we walked down the street. But as I stared at the forged transfers that paid for imported French orchids, that deep grief abruptly vanished. It did not slowly fade away. It evaporated instantly, entirely incinerated by a sudden massive surge of cold, calculated fury. My posture, which had been slumped and broken for the past 24 hours, automatically straightened. I felt my chest expand as I took a deep, steadying breath. The trembling in my scarred hands stopped completely. The sadness was entirely gone, replaced by a ruthless, burning desire for absolute justice. I was no longer a grieving father weeping over a lost son. I was a man who had been viciously attacked, and I was fully prepared to strike back with overwhelming, unstoppable force. I slowly slid the bank statement back across the polished mahogany desk toward my wealth manager. I looked Richard Dalton directly in his eyes. He saw the dramatic shift in my demeanor and sat up slightly straighter in his chair, recognizing that the parameters of our arrangement had just changed. Rick asked me if I wanted him to contact the authorities and file criminal charges for wire fraud and elder financial abuse. He assured me that with the undeniable evidence his team had gathered, Derek would be arrested before the end of the day. I shook my head slowly, a dark, rigid determination settling over my features. I leaned forward, resting my forearms heavily on the wooden table. I told him that an arrest was simply not enough punishment for what my son had done. I narrowed my gaze, visualizing the upcoming wedding reception, and spoke my final command. I do not just want him arrested, I told Rick, my voice dropping to a whisper. I want to break his ego in front of everyone he is trying to impress. I reached across the desk and pulled the wedding dossier toward me. I bypassed the catering invoices, stopping at the thick cardstock of the official wedding invitation. Printed in sweeping calligraphy, it demanded the presence of elite guests at a location known simply as the Grand Sterling. It was a sprawling estate on the wealthiest edge of the state where old money families held their exclusive gatherings. The Grand Sterling was not merely a venue. It was a towering symbol of pure, untouchable status. It boasted manicured gardens, a stone mansion, and a reputation requiring a waiting list of over 3 years to secure a reservation. Derek and Stephanie had bypassed that waiting list by offering an obscene, non-refundable premium paid for with the life savings my son had systematically drained from my bank account. They had chosen this estate because it was the ultimate stage for their grand illusion of wealth. I stared at the elegant gold foil, my mind working through the tactical possibilities of my newfound resources. If I wanted to truly break my son's arrogant ego in front of his prestigious audience, I could not just be an angry father making a scene. I needed absolute, undeniable leverage. I looked up at my wealth manager, formulating a plan that was as aggressive as it was poetic. I asked Rick who owned the estate. He navigated his property databases and informed me that the Grand Sterling was held by a private consortium of real estate investors, struggling slightly with the exorbitant maintenance costs of the historic property. They were highly motivated by profit, but carefully guarded the estate's prestige. I leaned back, a sense of absolute clarity washing over my mind. I did not just want to rent the venue, and I did not want to merely cancel the catering contract. I told Rick that I wanted to purchase the entire property outright. I instructed him to utilize the anonymous Texas company established for my winnings. He needed to approach the ownership consortium immediately with an unsolicited, overwhelming cash offer. I did not want prolonged negotiations or tedious inspections. I wanted to execute a swift, aggressive corporate maneuver that would transfer the legal ownership of the estate into my hands before the wedding commenced tomorrow afternoon. Rick raised his eyebrows in mild surprise, but the sharp, predatory smile of a seasoned corporate lawyer quickly spread across his face. He understood exactly what kind of power play I was initiating. He picked up his phone and immediately began calling commercial brokers. For the next few hours, I sat quietly and watched a masterclass in high-stakes financial warfare. Rick bypassed traditional channels and managed to secure a direct private conference call with the primary stakeholder of the ownership group. He introduced himself as the representative of an anonymous buyer looking to acquire a prestigious flagship property. He did not mince words. He told the stakeholder that my company was prepared to offer exactly $12 million in pure liquid cash for the immediate transfer of the estate. The lead stakeholder hesitated for a long moment, nervously stammering about current property valuations, desperately attempting to gain leverage in a sudden high-pressure negotiation. But Rick was utterly ruthless. He made it clear that the $12 million offer was a one-time proposition expiring by the end of the day. There would be no financing contingencies, no lengthy appraisal periods, and absolutely no delays. The sheer magnitude of the liquid cash combined with the aggressive deadline created a psychological pressure cooker that the ownership consortium simply could not resist. Within 3 hours, the desperate greed of the investors overwhelmed their hesitation. They officially accepted the unsolicited cash offer. Rick mobilized a massive team of corporate attorneys and escrow officers to expedite the transaction. The legal machinery of the financial elite moved with a terrifying speed that ordinary people never get to witness. Documents were drafted, signatures were secured, and massive wire transfers were pushed through the banking system. My $48 million fortune easily absorbed the $12 million purchase without making a single dent in my financial security. I watched the electronic confirmations roll in, completely fascinated by the invisible immense power of extreme wealth. My entire life I had been forced to wait in long lines and suffer through the slow, grinding bureaucracy of the working class. Now, with the right amount of money deployed by the right professional, I was quite literally moving massive mountains in a single afternoon. By the time the sun began to set over the city skyline, the massive real estate transaction was fully completed. The funds had cleared escrow, the contracts were binding, and the title of the historic property was officially transferred to my anonymous trust. Rick Dalton printed a stack of finalized legal documents and placed them onto the desk in front of me. He handed me a silver pen and pointed to the final page of the master deed. I gripped the heavy pen, staring down at the signature line. My calloused hand brushed against the crisp paper as I signed my name, permanently cementing the transaction. Rick quietly gathered all the paperwork, offered a firm handshake, and sincerely congratulated me on the purchase. I stood up and walked toward the window, looking out over the city. I pictured the botanical gardens of the Grand Sterling. I pictured the grand ballroom where Derek planned to pretend he was a self-made millionaire. He had stolen my life savings to buy a few hours of fake royalty, completely unaware that his father now held the ultimate trump card. My pulse steadied into a calm rhythm. A deep, profoundly satisfying sense of control settled into my bones. The trap was now perfectly, flawlessly set. I was no longer just an invisible guest, assigned to a dark corner near the catering kitchen. I was the absolute legal owner of the very ground my son would stand on to get married. I stepped out of the towering glass building and back into the biting evening air. The city lights were beginning to flicker on, illuminating the damp pavement. I walked to my rusted pickup truck, opened the heavy metal door, and climbed inside the freezing cabin. The sheer magnitude of what I had just accomplished hummed in my veins. I was now the sole owner of the most prestigious estate in the entire state. I held the ultimate power over the venue where my son intended to celebrate his fraudulent triumph. But the trap was not yet completely set. I needed to ensure Derek remained entirely blind to the reality closing in around him. I needed to feed his massive ego one last time to give him a false sense of absolute superiority, so his inevitable fall would be spectacular. I pulled my outdated phone from my coat pocket and dialed his number. Derek answered on the third ring, the loud, pulsating background noise of a busy restaurant bleeding through the speaker. He was likely at his rehearsal dinner after-party, drinking premium cocktails funded by my stolen retirement savings. He barked a sharp greeting into the phone, clearly annoyed by the interruption. I slumped my shoulders in the dark, empty cabin of my truck, physically settling into the role of the defeated, destitute father. I let a ragged, heavy sigh escape my lips before speaking. I forced my voice to sound incredibly weak and thoroughly exhausted. I told him I was sorry to bother him on the eve of his wedding, but I wanted to give him a piece of good news to ease the terrible burden I had placed on him the day before. I told my son that he did not have to worry about me becoming homeless anymore. I explained that I had spent the entire day walking from business to business begging for any kind of employment that would take a man of my advanced age. I spun a pitiful tale saying I had finally secured a job working the graveyard shift as a night security guard at a dilapidated shipping warehouse on the industrial edge of the city. I described the fake conditions in excruciating detail, hoping to trigger just a single ounce of human empathy. I told him I would be walking the perimeter on cold concrete floors for 12 hours a night, earning minimum wage just to afford cheap groceries, and rent a tiny room in a boarding house. I said my knees were already screaming in agony, but I was just grateful to have a way to survive the brutal winter. I stopped speaking and waited, listening to the muffled ambient music playing in the background of his location. Any decent human being, let alone a son speaking to the father who raised him, would have been horrified. A normal person would have felt an overwhelming wave of guilt hearing an old man resign himself to such a miserable, physically punishing existence. But Derek did not possess a normal heart. He possessed a hollow, calculating void. He let out a sharp, genuine sigh of relief. He did not express sorrow for my aching joints. He did not offer to supplement my meager income or return the $80,000 he had stolen from my bank account. Instead, his voice brightened with pure, unadulterated selfishness. "That is really great news, Dad," Derek said, his tone shockingly cheerful. "I am glad you figured it out. I knew you would land on your feet if you just applied yourself. It takes a lot of pressure off my shoulders to know you are handled." He was congratulating me for accepting a life of manufactured misery because it meant I was no longer his problem. But his cruelty did not stop there. He lowered his voice, stepping away from the loud music to speak directly into the receiver. He told me that since I had secured this new job, he expected me to be fully presentable at the wedding tomorrow. He explicitly commanded me to make sure I took a very long shower before arriving at the venue. He said he did not want me bringing any lingering warehouse smells into the grand ballroom. He reminded me with a thick layer of condescension that Stephanie's parents had extremely important business partners attending the reception. He demanded that I blend into the background and avoid embarrassing him in front of the high society guests he was so desperate to impress. I sat in the dark of my truck, a cold, genuine smile spreading across my face. He was handing me the exact ammunition I needed. I softened my voice into a pathetic, submissive whisper. I promised him I would scrub myself clean. I assured him I would wear my best suit and be on my absolute best behavior. I told him he would not even know I was there. Derek grunted his approval and hung up the phone without another word. I lowered the device, the digital screen illuminating the cold vapor of my breath. My son had completely failed the final test. There was no redemption left for him. The next morning, the sun rose bright and clear, casting a brilliant light over the manicured grounds of the Grand Sterling. I drove my rusted truck through the towering wrought iron gates. The security detail at the front entrance had already been briefed by their new corporate management. As I pulled up, the guards did not look at my battered vehicle with disdain. Instead, they stood perfectly straight and offered respectful nods, waving me through to the private tree-lined service road that led to the executive offices. I parked near the stone administrative building, far away from the bustling vendor activity taking place at the main mansion. I walked inside, where the atmosphere was entirely different from the frantic energy of the wedding planners outside. I was escorted directly into the plush, wood-paneled office of the general venue manager. He was a distinguished man in his 50s, currently sweating profusely under the collar of his tailored suit. He knew the property had just changed hands in a sudden massive cash transaction, and he was terrified of displeasing his new anonymous employer. I sat down in the heavy leather chair across from his desk and formally introduced myself. I asked him to pull the complete event file for the Burke and Reed wedding. The manager scrambled to comply, pulling a thick binder from his filing cabinet. I leaned forward and asked him to show me the specific internal communications regarding the seating chart and guest protocols. The manager hesitated, his face flushing a deep shade of crimson. He nervously shuffled through the papers, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out a printed email marked with a red, urgent stamp. He slid the paper across the desk, apologizing profusely, stating that the venue staff simply followed the strict directives of the client. I picked up the paper. The email was sent directly from Derek's corporate account. I read the words written by my own son, tracing the black ink with my calloused finger. The instructions were brutally precise. The email read, "Harrison Burke, father of the groom. Seat this individual at table 42. This table must be located adjacent to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen and the hallway leading to the guest restrooms. He is not to be seated anywhere near the VIP section or the bridal family tables. Furthermore, alert your security staff to monitor him closely. If he attempts to approach the head table, or if he attempts to commandeer a microphone to make a toast, security is authorized to physically intercept him and immediately escort him off the premises. If guests inquire, claim he is intoxicated and causing a disturbance." I read the cruel, calculating words a second time, letting the sheer malice of the instructions burn into my memory. Derek was not just hiding me. He was actively coordinating with armed security to have me physically thrown out of his wedding if I dared to act like his father. The manager watched me in absolute horror, realizing that the new owner of the multi-million-dollar estate was the exact same man the groom had ordered to be treated like a diseased trespasser. He began to stammer a frantic apology, offering to immediately upgrade my seating to the head table, offering to fire the security team, offering to completely rewrite the entire evening to my exact specifications. I raised my hand, silencing his panicked rambling. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a calm, terrifying precision. I told the manager that he was not to change a single detail of the seating chart. I instructed him to follow my son's email to the absolute letter. I wanted to sit exactly where Derek put me. I wanted to be placed next to the loud kitchen doors and the busy restrooms. However, I leaned across the desk, my eyes locking onto the manager with unwavering intensity. I told him I had my own secret mandate for the evening. I instructed him to gather the head of the audiovisual team and the executive catering director. I explained exactly what they were going to do the moment Derek raised his glass to begin his grand, fraudulent wedding toast. I outlined a sequence of events that would utilize the venue's massive technical infrastructure to execute my plan flawlessly. The manager listened with wide eyes, nodding furiously as he frantically took notes. The stage was now perfectly set. My son had built a towering castle of lies, and tonight I was going to turn on the lights and let the entire world watch it crumble. I left the sprawling grounds of the Grand Sterling, feeling a profound sense of calm. The mechanisms of my revenge were fully locked into place, ticking away like a perfectly oiled watch. But before the storm of the wedding consumed my weekend entirely, I had one vital piece of personal business to attend to. I drove my truck back into the city, pulling into the parking lot of the hospital, where my daughter Rachel was nearing the end of yet another grueling shift. Before stepping out of my vehicle, I made a brief, highly consequential phone call to Richard Dalton. I instructed my wealth manager to execute a specific financial maneuver we had discussed the previous evening. Rachel carried a crushing burden of $150,000 in nursing and medical school debt. It was a financial anchor that kept her working exhausting double shifts just to barely stay afloat. I directed Rick to create an anonymous philanthropic educational grant through my Texas-based company. I told him to wire the exact total of her outstanding balance directly to her loan providers, wiping the massive debt completely clean in a single untraceable stroke. I did not want her to know the money came from me, not yet. I simply wanted her to breathe. I wanted her to feel the crushing weight lift from her shoulders so she could finally live the life she truly deserved. I wanted to reward her pure heart before I destroyed Derek's arrogant illusion. She had never once asked me for a handout, even when she was surviving on instant ramen and sleeping in the hospital break room. Her dedication reminded me so much of Patty. My late wife would have been so incredibly proud of the resilient, compassionate woman our daughter had grown up to become. It was the least I could do. I walked into the hospital cafeteria and found Rachel sitting at a small plastic table in the corner. She looked incredibly pale, her nursing scrubs slightly wrinkled, and deep dark circles bruising the delicate skin under her eyes. Yet the moment she saw me approaching, her entire face lit up with a genuine, beautiful smile. She immediately stood up and wrapped her arms around my neck, holding me tight. We left the sterile hospital environment and walked to a modest, quiet diner across the street. We sat in a worn vinyl booth ordering simple sandwiches and hot coffee. Throughout the entire meal, Rachel did not complain about her own exhaustion. Instead, she spent the hour worrying entirely about me. She asked me a dozen questions about my fabricated night security job. She expressed deep concern about my joints handling the cold concrete floors of the warehouse. She even tried to slide a folded $20 bill across the table to pay for my lunch, insisting that she had picked up an extra shift and could easily afford it. I looked at that slightly crumpled $20 bill, and then I looked at the pure, unwavering love shining in my daughter's eyes. It was a staggering contrast to the empty, calculating void I had witnessed in Derek. Here was a woman who had absolutely nothing, yet she was willing to give me her very last dollar. I gently pushed the money back toward her, assuring her with a warm smile that I had received an advance on my new paycheck and that I was doing just fine. I sat there drinking my coffee quietly, marveling at the beautiful soul my late wife and I had managed to raise. Rachel was the true wealth of our family. After I hugged Rachel goodbye and watched her walk back toward the hospital, I drove to the most exclusive high-end men's boutique in the city's luxury shopping district. The impeccably dressed staff initially looked at my scuffed boots and faded coat with obvious disdain, ready to usher me back out the door. But their attitudes instantly shifted when I pulled out a heavy black titanium credit card linked directly to my trust. I demanded their absolute finest tailoring. I spent the next 2 hours being measured and fitted by a master tailor who worked with astonishing speed and precision. I purchased a bespoke midnight blue suit crafted from imported Italian wool, complete with a crisp silk shirt, a silk tie, and handcrafted leather dress shoes. The entire ensemble cost me exactly $5,000 paid in full on the spot. It was a suit designed for a man of immense power, a suit that commanded immediate absolute respect. The tailor carefully placed the pristine garments into a thick, opaque black garment bag, zipping it shut to hide the luxury within. I carried the heavy garment bag out to my truck, placing it gently across the back seat. I drove back to my quiet, aging house as the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon. I walked into my bedroom and laid the garment bag across my mattress. I unzipped it just enough to see the rich, midnight blue fabric catching the fading light. It was the armor I would wear for the final battle, but I was not going to wear it just yet. I walked over to my closet and pulled out the same worn-out 10-year-old suit I had worn to the rehearsal dinner. The fabric was thin, the elbows were slightly shiny from age, and the shoulders slouched in a way that made me look tired and defeated. I put the old suit on, buttoning the fraying shirt and tying the dull, faded tie. I slipped my feet back into my scuffed, unpolished shoes. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror. I looked exactly like the broke, senile embarrassment my son and his future wife believed me to be. I grabbed the black garment bag, folded it carefully over my arm, and walked out. It was now time to head to the venue for the final showdown. The drive to the sprawling estate took nearly an hour, but my mind was entirely focused on the performance ahead. I turned my rusted, battered pickup truck onto the pristine, tree-lined driveway of the Grand Sterling. The setting sun cast a spectacular golden hue over the manicured botanical gardens and the towering stone facade of the main mansion. I pulled up to the grand entrance where a team of valets in crisp uniforms were busy parking a fleet of imported luxury vehicles. When I rolled to a stop, the young valet approached my window with a look of sheer confusion, clearly wondering if I was a lost delivery driver. I handed him my keys with a polite nod, ignoring his hesitant posture. I knew something he did not. He was not parking a guest's vehicle. He was parking the vehicle of the man who owned the very pavement he was standing on. I stepped out of the truck, the cold evening air biting through the thin fabric of my worn 10-year-old suit. I carried the opaque black garment bag containing my bespoke armor over my arm, making sure it looked like nothing more than a cheap travel bag. I walked past the towering marble columns and handed the garment bag to a coat check attendant, instructing her to keep it safe for me until later in the evening. I made my way toward the massive outdoor terrace where the pre-wedding cocktail reception was already in full swing. The atmosphere was incredibly opulent. A string quartet played classical music softly in the corner, while waiters in pristine white tuxedos carried silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported champagne. The guests were a sea of designer gowns, custom-tailored tuxedos, and glittering diamond jewelry. As I stepped onto the terrace, the contrast between my presence and the high society crowd was jarring. I looked entirely out of place. My suit was painfully outdated, the fabric sagging off my shoulders, and my scuffed leather shoes stood out horribly against the polished stone floor. I could feel the immediate heavy weight of 100 judgmental eyes turning in my direction. Whispers rippled through the elegant crowd. People subtly stepped back as I walked past, creating a wide, isolating circle around me. I kept my head slightly bowed, playing the part of the broken, unwelcome outsider to absolute perfection. Before I could even reach the edge of the terrace to find a quiet corner, a booming, arrogant voice cut through the sophisticated chatter. I turned and saw Stephanie's father, Mr. Reed, marching directly toward me. He was a large man, his face flushed red from expensive bourbon, wearing a tuxedo that strained against his midsection. He wore a massive gold luxury watch on his wrist, a desperate projection of wealth that I now knew was completely fabricated. Having read the financial dossier compiled by my wealth manager, I knew this man was drowning in secret debt and facing imminent bankruptcy. Yet he carried himself like a feudal lord surveying his peasants. He wanted an audience, and he had clearly decided to use me as a prop to assert his social dominance in front of his wealthy associates. Mr. Reed stopped just a few feet away from me, ensuring that the surrounding guests had paused their conversations to watch the interaction. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering cruelly on the frayed edges of my shirt collar. He let out a loud, patronizing sigh that carried across the terrace. "Derek told me you had fallen on some incredibly hard times, Harrison," he said, his voice dripping with artificial, condescending pity. "He mentioned you were taking up some sort of minimum wage security job at a warehouse just to keep a roof over your head. It is a terrible shame to see a man of your age struggling so profoundly in his twilight years. You really should have planned your finances better." I kept my hands clasped in front of me, forcing a meek, subservient expression onto my face. I nodded slowly, playing perfectly into his arrogant narrative. Mr. Reed took a step closer, reaching into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a sleek leather money clip and deliberately peeled off a single crisp $50 bill. He held it up so the surrounding guests could see his grand gesture of charity. He reached out and aggressively shoved the folded bill directly into the breast pocket of my old suit jacket. "Take this, Harrison," he commanded loudly. "Go find yourself a decent hot meal somewhere in the city after the ceremony, and do us all a massive favor tonight. Try to stay entirely out of the professional photographs. We have a specific aesthetic we are trying to maintain, and we do not need to explain your situation to our business partners." The sheer audacity of the insult was staggering. A man who was secretly bankrupt was handing $50 to a man sitting on $48 million, telling him to go buy a hot meal and hide in the shadows. A younger, more impulsive version of myself would have pulled the deed to the estate out of my pocket and completely destroyed his entire existence right then and there. But I maintained my iron discipline. I reached up and patted the pocket holding the $50 bill. I looked directly into Mr. Reed's eyes, and offered him a tight, incredibly cold smile. "Thank you for your generosity," I replied, my voice steady and dangerously calm. "I promise you I will not forget how you treated me tonight." Mr. Reed chuckled, entirely missing the profound threat woven into my words. Before the arrogant man could say another word, a hand clamped down on my bicep with vicious, bruising force. I turned my head and saw Derek. His face was contorted in absolute, barely contained fury. He had spotted the interaction from across the terrace and was deeply humiliated that his high society guests were witnessing his father being treated like a vagrant beggar. But Derek did not intervene to defend my honor. He intervened to protect his own fragile image. He offered a strained, fake smile to his future father-in-law, apologizing for the interruption. Without a single word to me, he dug his fingers deep into my arm and began aggressively dragging me away from the crowd. He pulled me off the terrace through a set of heavy wooden doors and pushed me into a secluded, dimly lit hallway, far away from the music and the watchful eyes of the wedding guests. Derek released my arm and turned on me, his chest heaving with rage. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "What is wrong with you?" he hissed, his voice echoing sharply in the empty corridor. "I specifically told you to stay out of sight. I told you to blend into the background. And the first thing you do is go mingle with the most important people at this venue, looking like a total disaster, making me look like I come from a family of pathetic beggars. You are a complete embarrassment." I listened to his venomous tirade standing in the quiet hallway, adorned with antique portraits and thick, luxurious carpets. I looked at the son I had sacrificed my entire body to raise. I saw the pure, unadulterated hatred in his eyes. The test was officially over. There was no more reason to play the role of the frail, destitute victim. I took a slow, deliberate breath and rolled my shoulders back. I stopped slouching. I straightened my spine, drawing myself up to my full height. The pathetic, trembling demeanor I had projected for the past 2 days instantly vanished. I looked him dead in the eyes, my gaze hardening into something resembling solid granite. I checked my bank account today. "Derek," I said. My voice was no longer weak or wavering. It was deep, resonant, and echoed with absolute authority. Derek abruptly stopped his rant. He froze, his mouth hanging slightly open. The sudden drastic shift in my physical presence caught him completely off guard. "The $80,000 is gone." I continued stepping slowly toward him, forcing him to instinctively take a step backward. "The entire legacy account is completely empty." "Care to explain to me exactly how that happened?" I watched the color completely drain from my son's face. The arrogant, untouchable groom was instantly replaced by a man who realized he had been caught in a devastating trap. His eyes darted nervously around the empty hallway as his brain scrambled to formulate a lie, to construct some kind of financial excuse to cover his tracks. But the sheer weight of my unwavering stare broke his concentration. The mask he had worn for the past 2 years finally cracked and shattered into a million pieces. The panic in his eyes was quickly replaced by something far more sinister. It was replaced by a defensive, sociopathic rage. He realized he could not lie his way out of this, so he decided to attack. He closed the distance between us, his face twisting into an ugly, unrepentant snarl. "You want an explanation," he spat, his voice trembling with furious entitlement. "I took it. I took every single penny of it. And you know what? I do not feel a single ounce of guilt. You owe me that money. That money was my repayment for having to grow up in a miserable blue-collar household. Do you have any idea what it was like for me going to an elite university, wearing cheap clothes, smelling the disgusting construction dirt on your hands? Every time you came to visit me, I spent my entire life feeling inferior, feeling like a peasant surrounded by kings. I had to claw my way into this society. I needed that money to secure my future with Stephanie, to show these people that I belong here. You were just going to let it sit in a bank account while you rotted away in that depressing house. I put it to actual use. I elevated this family name. You should be thanking me." The sheer magnitude of his delusion was breathtaking. He was standing in a tuxedo paid for by my broken spine, justifying the absolute theft of my life savings because he felt embarrassed by the honest labor that kept him fed and educated. There was no remorse. There was no love. There was only a bottomless, narcissistic void. He truly believed he was the victim, and he truly believed he was entitled to bleed me completely dry. "If you ever bring this up again," Derek threatened, leaning in close so I could smell the expensive alcohol on his breath. "If you breathe a single word of this to Stephanie, or to her parents, or to anyone at this venue, I will have my security team drag you out of here by your collar and throw you onto the street. You are nothing but a guest here. This is my day. This is my world now. You will go sit at your table by the kitchen doors. You will keep your mouth shut, and you will stay out of my way. Do you understand me?" I absorbed his cruel, venomous words without flinching. The last remaining microscopic thread of paternal hope I held in my heart severed completely. He was gone. The boy I raised was dead, replaced by a greedy, soulless thief. I did not yell. I did not raise my hand to strike him. I simply looked at my son, nodding my head slowly, as a profound, terrifying calm settled over my entire being. "Enjoy your wedding, son," I whispered, my voice chillingly quiet. Derek sneered at me in disgust, violently turning on his heel. He pushed back through the heavy wooden doors and disappeared into the glittering, noisy crowd of the cocktail reception, completely unaware that he had just permanently sealed his own devastating fate. The next afternoon arrived with a crisp, mocking brilliance. The grand Sterling was transformed into a breathtaking spectacle of stolen opulence and fabricated luxury. I stood quietly near the back of the magnificent stone courtyard, carefully watching my son exchange vows under a towering archway woven entirely from thousands of imported white orchids. The very orchids that had drained the absolute last remaining dollars of my hard-earned life savings. Stephanie looked like a delicate porcelain doll in a custom designer gown, smiling triumphantly at the hundreds of high society guests seated in perfectly aligned, pristine rows. The string quartet swelled, the applause thundered, and the grand illusion was completely cemented. To the naked eye, they were the perfect, wealthy couple, embarking on a lifetime of privilege and uninterrupted grace. To me, they were two deeply flawed thieves, wearing expensive costumes, completely blind to the heavy guillotine slowly descending over their heads. I did not disrupt the elegant ceremony in any way. I sat quietly, in the very last row, wearing my worn suit, patiently biding my time. Let them have their vows, I thought to myself, as I watched them kiss. Let them feel invincible and untouchable for just a few more hours. The fall will only be that much harder when gravity finally takes hold. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the massive carved oak doors of the grand ballroom were thrown open for the reception. The room was a masterclass in financial gluttony. Towering crystal centerpieces caught the ambient light, casting a dazzling array of rainbows across the polished hardwood dance floor. The tables were draped in thick silk linens and set with heavy gold-rimmed porcelain plates. I walked past the beautifully arranged seating chart display, already knowing exactly where I was expected to go. I navigated through the labyrinth of laughing, glittering guests, moving further and further away from the radiant center of the room. I walked until the music began to muffle, until the light grew dim, until I reached the absolute darkest, most remote corner of the entire venue. Table 42. It was a small, poorly draped table shoved aggressively against the wall, positioned mere inches from the heavy swinging metal doors of the main catering kitchen. I sat down on a stiff wooden chair. The table wobbled unevenly under my weight, the uneven legs knocking against the hardwood. The air here was thick with the suffocating smell of industrial dishwashers, harsh chemical soap, and frying oil. Every few seconds, a waiter would burst through the swinging doors, the heavy metal hinges screeching loudly, carrying trays of discarded food or shouting frantic orders to the kitchen staff. The cold draft from the doors chilled my back, while the persistent noise completely drowned out the elegant string ensemble playing at the front of the room. It was the ultimate physical manifestation of my son's immense disrespect. He had literally discarded me into the trash corner of his perfect day, hoping I would simply vanish into the surrounding background noise. The dinner service began, and the sheer extravagance of the menu was staggering. Waiters flowed from the kitchen in perfectly choreographed lines, carrying heavy silver platters loaded with butter-poached lobster tails, beluga caviar, and thick cuts of Wagyu beef. Premium vintage wine was poured freely into endless crystal glasses. I sat at my wobbly table watching the lavish feast unfold from the shadows. A stressed waiter eventually rushed past my table and hurriedly dropped a small plate of dry, lukewarm chicken breast in front of me, entirely forgetting to offer me a glass of water. I did not complain. I simply picked up my tarnished fork and began to eat, my eyes carefully scanning the room. I noticed the wealthy guests seated at the tables closest to my dark corner. They were Stephanie's affluent friends, women dripping in real diamonds, and men wearing custom-tailored tuxedos. They cast frequent sidelong glances in my direction. I could vividly see the disgust wrinkling their noses as they took in my frayed shirt collar and severely scuffed shoes. One woman wearing a necklace that likely cost more than my original house leaned over and whispered something behind her hand to her companion. They both looked directly at me and let out a soft, mocking laugh. They viewed me as an unsightly stain on an otherwise flawless aesthetic. They pitied me. They despised me. They probably wondered how a destitute vagrant had managed to wander into such an exclusive, heavily guarded event. I absorbed every single sneer. I swallowed every pitying glance along with my dry, tasteless chicken. I sat with the absolute patience of an apex predator waiting for its prey to step firmly into the snare. They thought I was a pathetic, forgotten old man who had amounted to nothing. They did not realize that the very food they were chewing, the very chairs they were sitting on, and the very roof over their heads currently belonged entirely to me. The venue manager caught my eye from across the crowded room. I offered him a barely perceptible nod. He wiped a large bead of sweat from his forehead and quickly turned away, moving rapidly to coordinate with the audiovisual team. The gears were turning. The dinner service slowly concluded, and the ambient lighting in the massive ballroom dimmed to a soft, highly romantic glow. A low, expectant murmur rippled through the affluent crowd as the string quartet gracefully faded out their classical instruments. It was finally time for the evening's main events. It was time for the speeches. The guests tapped their silver spoons against their crystal glasses, creating a ringing, chiming cascade of sound that demanded the groom's immediate attention. Derek stood up from the exact center of the lavishly decorated head table. He adjusted the crisp cuffs of his tailored tuxedo, a look of profound, sickening arrogance plastered across his perfectly groomed face. He walked toward the main stage, projecting the absolute confidence of a man who believed he had successfully conquered the entire world. He stepped confidently onto the elevated platform and walked directly toward a sleek metal microphone stand. Positioned immediately behind him, serving as the glittering dominant centerpiece of the entire stage design, was a massive 10-tier champagne tower. The stacked crystal coupes overflowed with incredibly expensive vintage champagne sparkling brilliantly under the focused warmth of the overhead stage spotlight. It was a towering, beautiful monument to his vanity, a highly fragile structure built entirely upon the stolen, shattered ruins of my life savings. Derek grasped the microphone, pulling it from the stand with a smooth, highly practiced motion. He looked out over the sprawling sea of wealthy, expectant faces, his gaze intentionally skipping right over the dark, noisy corner where I sat hidden in the shadows. He raised his free hand into the air, signaling for complete silence. The massive ballroom fell completely quiet, hanging with breathless anticipation on his every single word. My son took a deep, theatrical breath, standing tall and proud, fully preparing to deliver a grand speech I knew, with absolute certainty, would be woven entirely from deceit, manipulation, and stolen glory. Derek cleared his throat, the sound projecting crisply through the state-of-the-art sound system. He offered a dazzling, perfectly rehearsed smile to the sea of expectant faces. He began by thanking the guests for traveling from near and far to celebrate this momentous occasion. His voice was smooth, carrying the polished cadence of a seasoned corporate executive. He spoke of love, destiny, and the beautiful partnership he had forged with Stephanie. He gestured toward her, and she beamed from her seat at the head table, radiating a sickening aura of unearned triumph. The audience cooed and clapped politely at his romantic platitudes, but the charming introduction was merely the appetizer. Derek soon shifted his posture, gripping the microphone slightly tighter, signaling a transition to a more serious, profound topic. The room grew even quieter as he lowered his voice to a hushed theatrical volume, preparing to deliver the core of his grand illusion. He told the crowd that standing in this magnificent ballroom felt like a surreal dream. He said that looking around at the elegance and the incredible success of everyone in the room made him deeply reflective of his own arduous journey. Then the true manipulation began. Derek launched into a deeply fabricated narrative of profound personal struggle. He spun a masterful tragic tale of being a completely self-made man. He boldly claimed that he had pulled himself up by his own bootstraps, fighting his way out of an incredibly bleak and unsupportive environment. He did not point to my dark corner, and he did not explicitly say my name, but the heavily implied insult was entirely unmistakable. He painted a vivid, pathetic picture of a childhood entirely devoid of opportunity, devoid of financial backing, and devoid of ambitious guidance. He told the affluent crowd that he had to forge his own path entirely alone, battling against a generational cycle of mediocrity and blue-collar stagnation. He spoke of long, hungry nights and a profound lack of emotional support, spinning a web of deceit that positioned him as a lone survivor rising from the ashes of a completely broken home. Listening from my wobbly table near the kitchen doors, my blood ran completely cold. I sat perfectly still, my scarred hands resting on my knees, absorbing the sheer, unadulterated venom of his lies. He was actively erasing every single drop of sweat I had shed for him. He was completely deleting the grueling double shifts, the shattered knees, and the agonizing back pain I endured to pay for the very education that allowed him to stand on that stage. He was standing in a custom-tailored tuxedo, paid for with my stolen life savings, claiming he had achieved everything through sheer, isolated grit. And the high society audience absolutely devoured every single word of his fraudulent martyrdom. They nodded in deep, sympathetic understanding, their faces softening with misplaced compassion. Several wealthy women dabbed at the corners of their eyes with expensive silk handkerchiefs, moved to tears by a story that was entirely fictional. A heavy round of spontaneous, admiring applause broke out across the massive ballroom, validating the disgusting narrative he had just woven. I looked over at Stephanie. She was sitting tall and proud at the head table, her chin raised high, looking incredibly smug. She relished the narrative of her husband being a diamond pulled from the rough dirt, a man who had transcended his pathetic origins to rightfully claim his place among the elite. She reached for her champagne glass, a victorious smirk playing on her painted lips, perfectly content with the public humiliation of the father she had banished to the shadows. Derek soaked in the immense adoration, bowing his head slightly in a display of manufactured humility. He waited patiently for the applause to gracefully subside before turning his attention back to his wealthy in-laws. He thanked Stephanie's parents for welcoming him into their prestigious family, praising their supposed business acumen and their exemplary moral character. He spoke of their generosity and their unmatched social standing, shamelessly kissing the ring of a bankrupt man. It was a truly pathetic exchange of fake flattery between two desperate frauds, both completely unaware of the impending ruin hovering directly above their heads. He continued his arrogant monologue by boasting about his rapid ascent in the corporate world. He spoke at length about his brilliant financial strategies, claiming he had built his substantial fortune through nothing but intelligent investments and an unwavering moral compass. He told the captive audience that he refused to rely on the charity of others, insisting that every single dollar in his bank account was earned through legitimate, honest channels. Hearing the absolute hypocrisy flow so freely from his mouth made my stomach churn with an overwhelming sense of disgust. He was literally bragging about a financial empire that was entirely propped up by the $80,000 he had quietly stolen from a grieving widower's joint legacy account. Finally, Derek turned his body slightly, positioning himself directly in front of the towering, glittering champagne pyramid. The structure sparkled brilliantly under the warm stage lights, a massive monument to his towering vanity. He reached out and gracefully grasped a crystal coupe from the adjacent table, holding the expensive liquid high into the bright spotlight. He called for the room to raise their glasses and join him in a final defining toast. He projected his voice to reach the very back of the room, ensuring every single guest heard his ultimate declaration of triumph. He told the audience that his miraculous journey proved that absolutely anything was possible if you stayed true to your core principles. He opened his mouth, smiled his most arrogant smile, and loudly declared a toast to pure honesty, to unyielding integrity, and to the sweet, undeniable rewards of hard work. And in that exact fraction of a second, just as the final triumphant syllable left his lips, the microphone in his hand went entirely dead. Derek tapped the dead microphone against his palm. A flicker of profound annoyance crossed his perfectly groomed features. He glanced toward the audiovisual booth, gesturing impatiently for the technicians to restore his audio. The ballroom was completely silent, the suspended anticipation rapidly curdling into an awkward, suffocating confusion. Then a sharp, piercing click echoed through the massive venue, followed instantly by the undeniable crisp hum of a live, open microphone. But the sound was not coming from the elevated stage. I stepped out from the heavy shadows of the swinging kitchen doors. As I walked forward, I reached up and unbuttoned the frayed, faded jacket of my 10-year-old suit. I slid the cheap fabric off my tired shoulders and let it drop carelessly onto the polished hardwood floor. Beneath it, I was wearing the bespoke midnight blue Italian wool suit I had purchased the day before. The pristine fabric clung to my frame with absolute perfection, instantly transforming my physical posture from a hunched, defeated old man into a figure of towering, undeniable authority. I held a sleek wireless microphone in my right hand, my grip steady and completely unwavering. I walked directly into the warm, ambient light of the main ballroom, leaving table 42 entirely behind me. The sudden transformation caused a visible ripple of shock to wash over the nearby guests. I strode straight down the central aisle toward the elevated stage and the VIP section. As I approached the perimeter, two massive armed security guards immediately stepped directly into my path. Derek saw them and pointed a trembling finger in my direction, silently demanding they intercept me. Instead, the guards looked me directly in the eyes, stepped smoothly to the side, and bowed their heads in a display of profound, absolute respect. They cleared the path completely, allowing me to pass unhindered. A collective gasp rose from the high society crowd. Stephanie leaped from her chair, her smug expression melting into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "That was a truly remarkable speech, Derek," my voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system, the deep resonance echoing off the magnificent crystal chandeliers. I stopped just a few feet away from the head table, staring directly up at my son on the stage. It was a beautiful, inspiring piece of total fiction. "You spoke with such incredible passion about being a completely self-made man. You told these lovely people that you pulled yourself up from nothing, that you survived a bleak, unsupportive childhood entirely by your isolated grit." Derek gripped his dead microphone tightly, his knuckles turning stark white. "Dad!" he hissed, his voice barely carrying over the edge of the wooden stage. "Stop this right now. You are embarrassing yourself in front of everyone. Get out of here before I have you physically thrown out." I ignored his pathetic threat completely and turned my body slightly to face the hundreds of wealthy guests. He forgot to mention a few minor details about that supposedly bleak childhood I announced to the captivated room. He forgot to mention the 40 grueling years his father spent pouring concrete and hauling heavy steel to successfully pay for his elite Ivy League education. He forgot to mention the shattered knees and the permanent nerve damage I willingly endured so he could wear custom-tailored tuxedos and pretend he was born into pure royalty. He did not build himself from absolutely nothing. He built his entire extravagant life directly on top of my broken spine. The grand ballroom was paralyzed. No one dared to take a single breath. I turned my attention back to the stage, gesturing toward the massive glittering pyramid of champagne positioned right behind him. But the absolute most creative part of your speech, I continued, my tone dripping with profound disgust, was your final toast to honesty and integrity. Because every single person in this room currently needs to know exactly how you paid for that spectacular champagne tower. You did not pay for it with your brilliant financial strategies. You paid for it by committing federal wire fraud. You forged my digital signature and systematically drained $80,000 from my joint legacy account. You stole every last penny of your grieving father's life savings to buy imported French orchids and vintage alcohol to impress people you do not even truly like. Stephanie let out a sharp, horrifying shriek, dropping her delicate crystal glass. It shattered violently against the table, the sharp, crashing sound cutting through the heavy silence. Derek was physically vibrating with blind rage and pure terror, his perfectly constructed facade entirely obliterated in less than 60 seconds. 2 days ago, I continued letting my voice drop to a cold, hard register. I came to your downtown penthouse. I begged you for a tiny loan to save my modest home from foreclosure. I stripped away every single ounce of my dignity and asked my only son to help me survive. And do you know what this honest, self-made man did? He looked me dead in the eyes, swore he was completely broke, and handed me a single $100 bill alongside a printed pamphlet for a destitute state-funded nursing home. He told me he could not carry my weight while actively spending my stolen retirement money on this very party. Derek finally snapped. The sheer public humiliation utterly shattered his fragile mind. He threw his dead microphone onto the stage floor and screamed at the top of his lungs. "Security!" he roared, his voice cracking with desperate, childish fury. "Grab this crazy old man and throw him out into the street. He is lying. He is a delusional, broke old fool. Remove him immediately." The head of security, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, walked calmly up the steps of the stage. He did not walk toward me. He walked directly up to Derek, bent down, and picked up the discarded microphone from the wooden floor. He looked at my son with an expression of absolute withering contempt. "We do not take orders from you, sir," the head of security stated, his deep voice projecting clearly into the silent room. "We take orders from the property owner." Derek stumbled backward, his knees visibly shaking. "What are you talking about?" he stammered frantically, looking around the massive room for any support. "Who is the owner?" I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and slowly pulled out the heavily notarized master deed of ownership. I unfolded the thick paper, holding it up so the bright stage lights caught the official gold seal. "This estate belongs to me, Derek," I said, delivering the final, devastating blow. "Just like the $100 million I won 3 weeks ago." The absolute silence that had gripped the grand ballroom shattered into a million pieces. A collective gasp, loud and ragged, erupted from the hundreds of wealthy guests. The sheer magnitude of my declaration hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. $100 million. The number echoed across the crystal chandeliers and bounced off the imported floral arrangements. I stood perfectly still, holding the master deed high in the air, watching the devastating reality crash into my son's fractured mind. The color completely drained from Derek's face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. His pristine, custom-tailored tuxedo suddenly looked like an oversized costume on a shrinking, cowardly boy. His knees, which had stood so firm and arrogant just moments before, visibly buckled. He stumbled backward, his hands grasping frantically at the edge of the stage to keep himself from collapsing entirely onto the polished wood. At the head table, Stephanie's father, Mr. Reed, shot up from his chair so fast it tipped over and crashed loudly onto the floor. The arrogant man, who had shoved a $50 bill into my pocket, was now turning a deeply concerning shade of purple. The veins in his thick neck bulged as he stared at the legal deed in my hand, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked from me to Derek, the horrifying realization dawning on him that his daughter had not married a financial savior, but a destitute, thieving fraud. The grand illusion of the Reed family's financial rescue had just been incinerated in front of the entire high society of the city. "Dad," Derek stammered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. His previously booming, confident tone was entirely gone, replaced by the desperate, frantic whining of a trapped animal. "Dad, please listen to me. This is all a massive misunderstanding. I was going to pay it back. Every single penny. I was just borrowing it to secure this venue, to secure the aesthetic. You know how important this network is for my career. I did not steal it. I was protecting our family image. We are family, Dad. You cannot do this to me. You won $100 million. We are rich. We do not have to fight about $80,000. I am your son. I am your only son." He was begging. The self-made man, the arrogant corporate executive who had banished me to a wobbly table by the kitchen doors, was now openly sobbing and pleading for a share of the fortune he had just discovered. He was trying to backtrack, trying to erase the cruel rejection he had dealt me when he thought I was bankrupt. His apologies were entirely hollow, driven only by the sudden revelation of my immense wealth. I lowered the deed and looked at him with absolute unwavering disgust. I did not offer him a single syllable of comfort. My silence only fueled his terrifying panic. Stephanie, who had been frozen in a state of pure shock, finally unthawed. She looked at Derek, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of horror and boiling rage. She was a woman who valued social status and financial security above absolutely everything else. She had married Derek because he projected the image of a wealthy rising star who could effortlessly fund her lavish lifestyle and save her drowning family. Now the mask had been violently ripped away. She realized she was legally bound to a man who was not only completely broke, but who had committed federal wire fraud to buy the very champagne tower sparkling behind them. And worse, in her eyes, Derek had just spectacularly fumbled a $100 million inheritance by treating his father like human garbage. "You lied to me," Stephanie shrieked, her voice tearing through the ambient murmur of the panicked guests. "You told me you were a self-made millionaire. You told me your family was irrelevant. You stole your own father's retirement money to buy my wedding flowers. You are a thief. You are an absolute fraud." Derek reached his trembling hands out toward her, tears streaming down his face. "Stephanie, my love, please," he begged, his voice dripping with pathetic desperation. "We can fix this. My dad has $100 million. He is just angry right now. We can apologize. We will be fine." "Do not touch me," Stephanie screamed, recoiling from him as if he were covered in a toxic disease. She looked around the room at her wealthy friends, her socialite peers, who were now watching her grand wedding turn into an unprecedented public humiliation. Her entire social standing was collapsing in real time. She turned her furious gaze back to Derek. She reached down and violently grabbed her left hand. With a sharp, aggressive tug, she pulled the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger. She reared back and threw the heavy ring directly at Derek's chest. The diamond struck his tuxedo jacket and bounced onto the wooden stage with a hollow metallic ping. "I am annulling this marriage tomorrow morning," she declared, her voice trembling with pure, unadulterated venom. "You are nothing but a pathetic, broke criminal, and I refuse to go down with you." Stephanie did not wait for a response. She gathered the heavy silk skirt of her custom designer gown and stormed off the elevated stage. She practically ran down the central aisle, pushing her way past the stunned guests, desperate to escape the catastrophic ruin of her perfect day. Her father scrambled to his feet, barking orders at her mother, and followed his daughter out the grand doors, leaving Derek completely abandoned on the stage. Derek fell to his knees, burying his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The magnificent champagne tower sparkled mockingly behind his pathetic, crumpled form. The hundreds of guests were trapped in a state of chaotic paralysis, unsure if they should flee or continue watching the incredible disaster unfolding before them. Before the murmurs could escalate into a full panic, the heavy carved oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung wide open. The sudden, forceful movement drew the attention of every single person in the room. Richard Dalton, wearing a sharp, immaculate suit, walked purposefully through the entrance. His expression was entirely devoid of emotion, a cold professional executing a flawless legal maneuver. But Rick did not walk in alone. Flanking him on either side were two uniformed police officers, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts. They held official stamped documents in their hands. They marched straight down the center aisle, their heavy boots thudding against the polished hardwood floor, carrying active warrants for wire fraud, identity theft, and elder financial abuse. The sight of uniformed police officers marching into the grand ballroom sent a final shattering shockwave through the affluent crowd. The guests instinctively parted, pressing themselves against the silk-draped tables to create a wide, clear path for the authorities. Rick Dalton stopped beside me, offering a curt professional nod before gesturing toward the elevated stage. The two officers did not hesitate. They ascended the wooden steps with heavy, deliberate strides, walking directly toward the crumpled, sobbing figure of my son. Derek looked up through his tears, his eyes widening in absolute terror as the officers stood over him. Derek Burke, the lead officer, stated, his authoritative voice carrying easily across the silent room without the need for a microphone. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, forgery, and elder financial abuse. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Derek let out a guttural, agonizing wail. He scrambled backward, bumping into the table holding the massive champagne tower. The crystal coops rattled ominously, threatening to collapse. "Dad, tell them to stop," Derek pleaded, his voice completely raw. "I am your son. You cannot let them do this. I will give it all back. Please do not let them take me to jail. I am begging you." I stood completely motionless in my bespoke midnight blue suit. I looked at the man begging on his knees, and I felt absolutely nothing. The paternal instinct to protect him had been entirely incinerated the moment he handed me that nursing home pamphlet. I did not speak. I simply watched as the officers grabbed him by the arms, hauling him forcefully to his feet. The cold, sharp click of the metal handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the room, sounding like the closing of a heavy vault door. The officers turned him around, guiding him down the stage steps. I raised my hand, pointing directly toward the dark corner of the venue. "Take him out through the kitchen doors," I commanded, my voice flat and unyielding. The officers nodded, marching the disgraced handcuffed groom past the stunned, silent guests. I watched my son, the arrogant corporate executive, being paraded through the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen, precisely the same hidden, degrading route he had demanded I use just to use the restroom. The heavy doors swung shut behind him, completely erasing him from the beautiful venue he had stolen my life savings to secure. I turned my attention to the hundreds of wealthy, perfectly dressed guests still frozen in their seats. "You are all trespassing on private property," I announced, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "This wedding is officially over. The bar is closed. The catering is suspended. I expect every single one of you to gather your belongings and vacate my estate within the next 15 minutes. Anyone remaining on the premises after that time will be removed for trespassing by my private security team." The room erupted into a frantic, chaotic scramble. The elite socialites, the arrogant business partners, and the pretentious friends who had sneered at my worn suit just hours ago were now rushing desperately toward the coat check. They tripped over their expensive gowns and shoved each other in a panicked herd, entirely desperate to flee the spectacular collapse of the Burke and Reed illusion. I watched them run, a profound sense of catharsis washing over my entire body. As the grand ballroom rapidly emptied, I signaled for the venue manager. I instructed him to gather every single member of the catering staff, the bartenders, the valet drivers, and the security personnel. Within minutes, dozens of hard-working, exhausted employees stood nervously before me near the stage. They were the people who actually sweated to build this event. People who reminded me so much of my own decades in the working class. I asked Rick Dalton for his leather briefcase. I pulled out a heavy checkbook linked directly to my Texas trust. I wrote a single massive check for $1 million, making it payable to the venue's employee union fund. I handed the check to the stunned manager, instructing him to divide it equally among every single worker present tonight. I told them it was a bonus for dealing with the absolute worst kind of people. The staff gasped, some breaking into tears of pure joy, their grueling night ending in an unexpected, life-changing miracle. The scene shifts to 2 months later. The bitter winter cold has been entirely replaced by a warm, gentle coastal breeze. I am sitting on the expansive wooden deck of my newly purchased sprawling beachfront property. The ocean waves crash rhythmically against the pristine white sand, a soothing soundtrack to my entirely transformed life. I take a sip of freshly brewed premium coffee from a heavy ceramic mug, enjoying the profound, uninterrupted peace of the morning. Sitting at the glass patio table across from me is my daughter Rachel. The dark, exhausting circles under her eyes have completely vanished. Her posture is relaxed, vibrant, and incredibly healthy. The crushing burden of her medical school debt has been entirely erased, and she no longer works grueling double shifts to survive. She is smiling brightly, unfurling a large roll of architectural blueprints across the table. The blueprints detail the construction of a brand new state-of-the-art free medical clinic that I am fully funding in her name. It will serve the underprivileged communities in our old neighborhood, a lasting, honorable legacy built on compassion rather than vanity. I look at her radiant face and think back to the tragic events of that wedding. My late wife, Patricia, was absolutely right. Money did not change my son. The money simply took off his carefully constructed mask, revealing the selfish, hollow thief that was always hiding beneath the surface. And the same wealth allowed me to see the pure, unyielding gold that resided in my daughter's heart. I used my fortune to permanently sever the toxic infection from my life, and I am using the rest to build a beautiful future for the one child who truly deserves it. My son is currently sitting in a federal prison cell, waiting for his long trial, stripped of his suits, his arrogance, and his stolen prestige. Sometimes the most profound act of love a father can perform is allowing his child to face the absolute crushing weight of their own terrible consequences. If you were in my shoes, would you have let the police take your own son away? Let me know in the comments below.